Chapter 1. The Garden Party at Rose Hill Manor. The sun hung low over the village of Rose Hill, casting a golden haze across the manicured lawns and flower beds that seemed to bloom with an almost defiant cheerfulness. It was the height of summer, and the annual garden party at Rose Hill Manor was in full swing, a tradition as unshakable as the church bells that rang out from St. Peter's every Sunday morning. Ladies in floral frocks and wide-brimmed hats fluttered about like butterflies, balancing plates of cucumber sandwiches and scones slathered with clotted cream. Gentlemen in lightweight suits and Panama hats discussed the cricket scores or the latest woes of the county council with the sort of measured enthusiasm that passed for excitement in these parts. Rose Hill was much like any other English village one might stumble upon in the gently rolling hills of the home counties. A cluster of thatched cottages, a post office that doubled as the hub of all gossip, a village green where children played hopscotch under the watchful eyes of their nannies, and at its heart, the manor house itself. Rose Hill Manor had stood for centuries, its ivy-clad walls whispering of old families and older secrets. The current occupants, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, no relation to those Bantrys of St. Mary Mead, though the names did cause a raised eyebrow or two, were the sort of people who opened their gates once a year to remind the villagers of their place in the social order. It was all very civilized, very proper, and utterly predictable. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wicker chair beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree, observed it all with her customary quiet attentiveness. She was a slight figure, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a modest lace cap, her grey eyes mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Dressed in a simple woolen cardigan, despite the warmth, old habits died hard, she sipped her tea from a delicate china cup, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. To the casual observer, she was just another elderly spinster, content to while away the afternoon with her wool and her thoughts. But Miss Marple noticed things. She noticed the way Mrs. Hargreaves from the post office lingered a fraction too long over the vicar's wife, her lips pursed in that telltale sign of disapproval. She noticed young Tommy Pike, the gardener's boy, sneaking glances at the Colonel's niece, Miss Lydia Bantry, who laughed a little too brightly at the jokes of the dashing Captain Everett. Miss Marple," came a voice at her elbow, pulling her from her reverie. It was Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed chronicler of events, her ample bosom heaving with the effort of navigating the crowd in her tight corsetry. "Isn't it a splendid afternoon? Though I must say the Colonel has outdone himself with the roses this year. My Arthur, rest his soul, always said roses were a man's way of apologizing for the thorns in life." Miss Marple smiled gently, setting down her cup on the small table beside her. "Indeed, Mrs. Price Ridley, the Colonel does have a fine hand with them. And how is your garden faring this season? I hear you've had trouble with the aphids." Mrs. Price Ridley launched into a detailed account of her battles with garden pests, her voice rising and falling like a sermon. Miss Marple listened politely, her mind wandering to the parallels she so often drew between human folly and the natural world. People were much like gardens, she thought, outwardly blooming but prone to hidden blights if one didn't pay attention. The party was a microcosm of Rose Hill life. There was Dr. Haydock, the village physician, deep in conversation with the vicar about the upcoming harvest festival. Nearby, old Mr. Clement, the retired banker, dozed in a deck chair, his newspaper folded neatly over his knee. The younger set clustered around the refreshment tent. Miss Lydia Bantry with her fashionable bobbed hair and lively eyes, Captain Ralph Everett, recently returned from service in India, his tanned face and easy charm drawing admiring glances, and Miss Evelyn Pritchard, the Colonel's secretary, a quiet young woman with a penchant for sensible shoes and an air of efficiency that bordered on severity. It was Evelyn who caught Miss Marple's eye just then. The girl was arranging a tray of teacups on a side table near the manor's French doors, her movements precise but hurried. She paused to adjust a particularly ornate teacup on the mantelpiece inside, the one with the delicate gold rim and painted roses that Mrs. Bantry was so proud of, a family heirloom from her grandmother's day. Evelyn's hand lingered on it for a moment, as if tracing the pattern, before she turned back to her duties. The colonel himself was holding court near the rose arbor, his booming laugh carrying across the lawn. "Everett, my boy, you must tell us more about those tigers in Bengal. Did you really bag one with a single shot?" Captain Everett grinned, launching into a tale that had the gentlemen chuckling and the ladies gasping in delighted horror. Mrs. Bantry, a plump woman with a fondness for lavender water, and even fonder of being the center of attention, fluttered her fan and declared it all too thrilling for words. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Human nature, she reflected, was ever the same. The colonel with his military bluster, his wife with her social ambitions, the captain with his wanderlust and charm. These were types she had encountered 100 times before, in villages much like this one, and yet each held their own little secrets, like seeds buried in soil, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. The afternoon wore on pleasantly enough. Tea was served at 4 o'clock precisely, as was customary. The villagers mingled, exchanging pleasantries about the weather, unusually fine, the crops, promising, and the latest scandal from the neighbouring parish, a maid dismissed for pilfering, though opinions varied on her guilt. Miss Marple accepted a second cup from a passing maid, murmuring her thanks, and resumed her knitting, a scarf for her nephew in London, though she suspected he would consign it to the back of a drawer. It was then that the first hint of discord crept in, subtle as a shadow crossing the sun. Miss Lydia Bantry had wandered off toward the manor's library window, ostensibly to admire the view of the herb garden. Captain Everett followed a moment later, his voice low as he caught up with her. Miss Marple, from her vantage point, could not hear the words, but she saw the girl's flushed cheeks, and the captain's earnest expression. A lover's quarrel, perhaps, or something more calculated. Lydia was the colonel's heiress, after all, and Captain Everett had the look of a man who appreciated security as much as adventure. Before Miss Marple could ponder it further, a sharp cry pierced the air, not loud but startling in its abruptness. It came from inside the manor, near the drawing-room that opened onto the terrace. Heads turned. Mrs. Bantry dropped her fan with a clatter. "What on earth?" she began, but her words were cut off by a second sound, a crash, like porcelain shattering against stone. The crowd surged toward the French doors, a ripple of curiosity and concern. Miss Marple rose slowly, folding her knitting with care, and followed at a measured pace. She was not one for rushing. Haste clouded the mind. By the time she reached the threshold, a small knot of people had gathered in the drawing-room. Colonel Bantry stood in the center, his face puce with rage or shock. It was hard to tell which. On the floor lay the shards of the heirloom teacup, the one Evelyn had so carefully placed on the mantel not an hour before. Its delicate form was irreparably broken, fragments scattered like confetti across the Persian rug. But it was not the teacup that held everyone's attention. Slumped in an armchair by the fireplace was Captain Ralph Everett, his head lolling at an unnatural angle, a thin line of blood trickling from his temple. His eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling, and in his right hand he clutched a heavy brass paperweight from the desk, now stained crimson. "Good God!" exclaimed Dr. Haydock, pushing through the crowd. He knelt beside the captain, feeling for a pulse with practiced efficiency. After a moment he looked up, his face grim. "He's dead. Blunt force trauma to the head. Must have happened moments ago." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Bantry swayed, clutching at her husband's arm. "Ralph? Dead? But he was just outside telling stories." Miss Lydia let out a small, choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Evelyn Pritchard stood frozen by the mantel, her face pale as milk, staring at the broken teacup as if it held the answers to some unspoken riddle. "Who could have done this?" whispered Mrs. Price Ridley, her earlier gossip forgotten in the face of real tragedy. "In broad daylight at our own party!" The colonel barked orders, his military training kicking in. "No one leave the room. Haydock, secure the scene. Someone fetch Constable Pork, quickly. Miss Marple lingered at the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the details others missed in their panic. The paperweight in the captain's hand. Odd that he should be holding it if he were the victim. The position of the body, slumped as if struck from behind. And the teacup. Why had it fallen from the mantel, so far from the chair? There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture. It was all too neat, too contained. Villagers murmured amongst themselves, theories bubbling up like tea in a kettle. Robbery. But nothing's taken. A lover's spat. Lydia was arguing with him earlier. Or that secretary girl, she was in here alone. Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was already turning over the possibilities. Murder in Rosehill? It seemed impossible, yet here it was, staring them in the face. She had seen such things before, in other villages, under other guises. Human nature did not change, whether in the city or the countryside. Greed, jealousy, fear. These were the roots that fed the darkest acts. As Constable Pork arrived, puffing from his hurried cycle from the station, and began his bumbling questions, Miss Marple slipped quietly back to her chair under the oak. The party was over, the gaiety shattered like the teacup on the mantel. But for Miss Marple, the real work was just beginning. She would listen, observe, and piece together the truth from the fragments others overlooked. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, and Rosehill's peace was fractured forever. Chapter 2. The Village Whispers. The morning after the garden party, Rosehill awoke to a hush that felt almost conspiratorial. The sun rose as it always did, gilding the thatched roofs and coaxing the hollyhocks along the lane, but the village green lay empty. No children played tag, no baker's boy whistled as he peddled his deliveries. Even the rooks in the elms seemed to caw with restraint. Word of Captain Everett's death had spread faster than measles in a schoolroom, and by 9 o'clock every curtain in the high street had twitched at least twice. Miss Marple took her usual path to the post office, a wicker basket over her arm, and her grey kid gloves spotless despite the dust of the lane. She walked slowly, nodding to those she passed, but her mild blue eyes missed nothing. The net curtain that dropped too quickly at Mrs. Simms's cottage, the cluster of maids outside the dairy, heads together like conspiratorial starlings, the way old Mr. Badger, the verger, pretended sudden interest in his bootlace when she drew near. Inside the post office the air was thick with the scent of ink, sealing wax, and unspoken suspicion. Mrs. Hargreaves stood behind the counter, sorting the morning mail with the solemnity of a priest at the altar. Her lips were compressed into a thin line, and the steel pins in her bun gleamed like miniature daggers. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, though her eyes flicked to the door as if expecting the murderer to stroll in for a halfpenny stamp. "Terrible business. Terrible. They say the captain was struck down in the very act of taking tea." Miss Marple laid her letters on the counter. "One imagines the tea grew cold rather quickly," she murmured, though I dare say the shock was colder still. Mrs. Hargreaves leaned forward, lowering her voice to the register reserved for state secrets and village scandals. "They've taken young Tommy Pike in for questioning. Constable Polk's idea, of course. Says the boy was seen lurking near the French windows not 10 minutes before before. And everyone knows he's sweet on Miss Lydia. Jealousy, mark my words." Miss Marple's fingers paused over her purse. "Tommy Pike, the gardener's lad. He can scarcely be 18, and his hands tremble when he lifts anything heavier than a trowel." "Passion makes a man of a boy," Mrs. Hargreaves declared with grim satisfaction. "And there's talk of a letter, found in the captain's pocket, half burned in the grate. Addressed to Miss Lydia, but signed only with an initial. An E, they say. Could be Evelyn Pritchard, the secretary. Cool as a cucumber, that one. But you know what they say about still waters." Miss Marple paid for her stamps and accepted her change with a polite murmur. As she turned to leave, the bell above the door jingled, and Dr. Haydock entered, his medical bag clutched like a shield. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his hat. "I was hoping to find you. The inquest is set for tomorrow, but I wondered if you might walk with me to the manor. Colonel Bantry's in a state, and Mrs. Bantry has taken to her bed with sal volatile. I thought a calm voice might steady them." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I should be delighted, Doctor, though I fear my voice is rarely raised above a whisper." They left the post office together, the doctor's long strides shortened to match her gentler pace. The lane to Rosehill Manor wound past the duck pond and the lich gate of St. Peter's, where the verger was sweeping yesterday's confetti from the path with unnecessary vigour. "Blunt force," Heideck said abruptly, as though the words had been weighing on him. "Single blow to the right temple." The paperweight was the weapon, brass heavy enough, death instantaneous, or near enough. No defensive wounds. Whoever struck him came from behind, and the captain never saw it coming. Miss Marple considered this. He was seated, slumped rather, as though he'd been standing, then sat or was pushed into the chair after the blow. Curious that, and the teacup on the mantel, smashed clean off its saucer. Yet the saucer itself was intact on the table. Someone moved it, or threw it, with considerable force. They walked in silence for a moment, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their shoes and the distant lowing of cattle. "Constable Polk is satisfied with young Pike," Haydock continued, "but I'm not. The boy's shoulders couldn't deliver that sort of blow without winding himself. And there's the question of timing. Half the village was within 20 yards of the drawing-room. A murderer would need nerves of steel, and a motive stronger than calf love." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the manor's chimneys, just visible above the beeches. "Motives are rarely simple, Doctor. Like onions, they come in layers. Peel one and another appears beneath. At the manor they were admitted by a flustered parlour-maid whose apron was askew and whose eyes were red-rimmed. The colonel met them in the hall, his face the colour of rare steak. "Damn nonsense, arresting that boy," he barked. "Pike's been pruning my roses since he was knee-high. Couldn't kill a slug without apologizing to it first." Mrs. Bantry lay upon a chaise longue in the morning-room, a lavender-scented handkerchief pressed to her brow. At the sight of Miss Marple she gave a tremulous smile. "Dear Miss Marple, how good of you to come. I declare I shall never feel safe in my own drawing-room again. Poor Ralph. Such a charming man, and so full of stories. To think he met his end beside my grandmother's teacup." Miss Marple seated herself on a pettit-point chair and folded her hands in her lap. "Grief often seeks an object, Mrs. Bantry. The teacup is merely the nearest. Tell me, had Captain Everett any enemies in the village? Debts, perhaps, or a disagreement over cards?" The colonel snorted. "Everett! Debts up to his eyebrows, more likely. Always borrowing a fiver here, a tenner there. But murder for a few pounds? Ridiculous." "Yet men have killed for less," Miss Marple said mildly. "And women, too, when pride is wounded." Mrs. Bantry sat up, her handkerchief fluttering. "You cannot mean Lydia. She was devoted to him, positively hanging on his every word." "Devotion can curdle into desperation," Miss Marple observed, "though I should not like to think it of your niece. And Miss Pritchard, she was in the drawing-room shortly before the tragedy, was she not? Arranging the tea things," Mrs. Bantry said. "Efficient girl, came to us 6 months ago with excellent references, though between you and me she has a way of looking at one that makes the spine tingle, as though she knows exactly how much one paid for one's hat." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. The police took the paperweight and the fragments of the teacup. Also a scrap of notepaper from the grate, burned but legible in parts. "Cannot continue. Meet me at 4. The rest is ash." Colonel Bantry paced to the window. "Everett was alive at 20 to 4. I saw him myself regaling the vicar with tales of tiger hunts. By 5 minutes past he was dead. That narrows the window considerably." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, now bare where the teacup had stood. A faint ring of dust marked its former place, and beside it a small brass carriage clock ticked with mournful precision. 4 o'clock, she repeated softly. "The hour when the village takes tea. When maids are busy in kitchens, guests on the lawn, and the drawing room. Empty. Except for the murderer, Mrs. Bantry whispered, and clutched her handkerchief anew. Miss Marple rose. I wonder, Colonel, if I might see the library. Captain Everett was fond of books, I believe. There may be some small clue among his borrowings. The Colonel hesitated, then shrugged. As you like, though the police have already turned the place upside down. The library smelled of leather, tobacco, and the particular mustiness of old paper. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like guilty secrets. On the desk lay a scatter of correspondence, a half-finished letter to a London club, and, Miss Marple noted with interest, a railway timetable open to the page for Southampton departures. She moved to the bookshelf nearest the connecting door to the drawing room. A gap showed where a volume had been removed. The remaining books leaned together like conspirators. Running her finger along the spines, she paused at a slim leather-bound journal wedged between a treatise on angling and a dog-eared copy of Kipling. "Captain Everett's?" she inquired. The Colonel frowned. "Didn't know he kept one. Borrowed the Kipling last week. Said it reminded him of India." Miss Marple drew the journal out. Its pages were filled with a bold, impatient scrawl. Dates, sums of money, cryptic initials. The final entry, dated the day before the garden party, read, "E. insists on settlement. Must have the ruby by Friday or all is lost." Damn the woman. She closed the book gently. It seems Captain Everett had pressing obligations, and a lady, initial E, who was not prepared to wait. Dr. Haydock's eyebrows rose. "Blackmail, or a debt of honor," Miss Marple said. "The distinction is often academic to the debtor." From the hall came the sound of raised voices, Constable Polk, pompous and insistent, demanding to see the Colonel. Miss Marple slipped the journal into her handbag with the unobtrusive grace of one returning a borrowed handkerchief. As they emerged, Puck stood in the doorway, helmet tucked beneath his arm, his face flushed with official zeal. "Begging your pardon, sir, but we found the weapon's twin in the gardener's shed. Brass, same weight, and young Pike's fingerprints all over the handle of the French door. Case closed, I'd say." The Colonel's moustache bristled. "Poppycock. The boy oils those handles every week." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the constable's gleaming buttons. Fingerprints, indeed. In her experience, the loudest evidence was often the least conclusive. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, burnishing the rosebeds where Tommy Pike had labored since dawn of the previous day. Somewhere in the village, a clock struck 11, and Miss Marple walked thoughtfully back toward the high street, the journal a small damning weight against her side. Behind her, Rose Hill buzzed louder than any beehive. Tommy Pike was in the lockup at Much Benham. Lydia Bantry had locked herself in her room with hysterics, and Evelyn Pritchard had been seen leaving the manor by the servants' entrance, a suitcase in hand. By lunchtime, the village had convicted and hanged the gardener's boy a dozen times over. By tea-time, the first cracks in the story began to appear. A maid who swore she had seen Miss Pritchard in the drawing-room at 5 minutes to 4, teacup in hand. The vicar's wife who insisted Tommy had been helping her carry hymnals at the crucial moment, and old Mr. Clement, roused from his nap, who claimed to have heard 2 voices arguing behind the library door, one male, one unmistakably female. Miss Marple took her tea alone in her small sitting-room, the journal open before her. She traced the looping E with a delicate finger, and recalled the way Evelyn Pritchard had touched the broken teacup, as though it were a talisman or a threat. Human nature, she reflected, was a tapestry of fine threads. Pull one and the pattern shifted. Somewhere in Rose Hill a thread had been cut with brutal precision. It was her task to find the scissors. Outside her window the village settled into an uneasy dusk. Lights winked on in cottage windows, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the heavier odor of fear. Tomorrow the inquest would convene, and the machinery of justice would grind its predictable path. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that justice and truth were not always fellow travelers. She closed the journal, set it carefully aside, and reached for her knitting. The scarf for her nephew was growing longer, stitch by patient stitch. Like any investigation, it required time, precision, and an unwavering belief that every loop, however small, mattered to the whole. Chapter 3. The Inquest and the Unseen Hand. The inquest was held in the parish hall, a squat red brick building that normally housed whist drives and the Women's Institute. On this grey Tuesday morning it smelled of damp hymnals, and the particular staleness of chairs stacked too long in a corner. A trestle table had been draped with the Union Jack. Behind it sat the coroner, Mr. Justice Fothergill, a retired solicitor from Much Benham, whose whiskers twitched whenever he was displeased. To his left perched Constable Polk, helmet gleaming like a second head. To his right Dr. Haydock, medical bag at his feet and an expression of professional resignation. The hall was packed. Villagers filled the benches in order of social precedence. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry in the front row, Mrs. Bantry clutching a black-edged handkerchief, though the captain had been no blood relation. Miss Lydia pale and red-eyed beside her aunt. Evelyn Pritchard, neat in navy serge, hands folded so tightly the knuckles showed white. Miss Marple had taken a seat near the back, half hidden by Mrs. Price Ridley's formidable hat. She had brought her knitting, something small and lavender, intended for the church bazaar, and the needles moved with the calm rhythm of long practice. The coroner cleared his throat. "We are here to establish the cause of death of Captain Ralph Everett, late of the 14th Bengal Lancers, found deceased at Rose Hill Manor on the afternoon of the 14th instant." Dr. Haydock was called first. He gave his evidence with clipped precision. Time of death between 3:50 and 4:05 p.m. Single blow to the right temporal region. Weapon the brass paperweight. Exhibit A, now resting on the table like a malevolent paperweight indeed. No alcohol in the blood. No signs of intoxication. The captain had been in robust health, until the moment he was not. Constable Polk followed, swelling with importance. He produced a plan of the drawing room, drawn in purple ink on graph paper, and pointed with a stubby finger. "Body here, sir. Paperweight here. Teacup fragments scattered thus." He described the partial letter found in the grate, the railway timetable, the second paperweight discovered in the gardener's shed, and the prisoner. Beg pardon. The witness Thomas Pike, his dabs on the French door handle plain as daylight. Tommy Pike was brought in next, blinking in the gaslight. He had been given a clean shirt, but the cuffs were too short and his wrists stuck out like pale twigs. When asked his whereabouts at 4 o'clock, he stammered that he had been coiling hose behind the potting shed. Miss Jenkins, the cook, had seen him at 10 minutes to the hour, and the vicar's wife at 5 minutes past, but the intervening 15 minutes were, regrettably, unaccounted for. "Jealousy is a powerful motive," Polk declared. "The lad fancied Miss Bantry. Captain Everett was a rival." Tommy flushed crimson and mumbled something about only wanting to give Miss Lydia a nosegay of sweet peas. Miss Lydia was summoned. She entered with the air of a tragedy queen, eyes downcast, a black veil lending drama to her youthful grief. Under gentle questioning, she admitted to a warm friendship with the captain. Yes, they had quarrelled the previous evening over a trifling matter, something about a letter he wished her to post. No, she had not seen him alone on the afternoon of the party. Her voice trembled, but her gaze, when it flicked toward Evelyn Pritchard, held a flash of something sharper than sorrow. Evelyn's evidence was brief and colourless. She had arranged the tea tray at 20 to 4, then returned to the terrace to assist Mrs. Bantry with the cucumber sandwiches. She had not entered the drawing room again until the alarm was raised. The coroner asked about the teacup. Had she placed it on the mantel? Yes, at Mrs. Bantry's express instruction. It was a favourite piece, and the light from the window showed the painting to advantage. She had noticed nothing amiss. Miss Marple's needles paused. The girl's voice was steady, but her left thumb rubbed the cuff of her right sleeve in a small, repetitive motion. Nerves, or the attempt to conceal them. Colonel Bantry testified gruffly that the captain had been a guest for a fortnight, a distant cousin by marriage, fond of cards and indifferent to his debts. Mrs. Bantry wept theatrically and was excused. The verger, Mr. Badger, was the last witness. He had been trimming the yew hedge near the library window and claimed to have heard voices at approximately 3:55, a man's, low and urgent, and a woman's, sharp with anger. He could not swear to the words, but Ruby and Friday had been distinct. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Gentlefolk often quarrelled over trifles. The coroner summed up. Death by misadventure was impossible. Suicide, given the angle of the blow, equally so. The jury retired for 7 minutes and returned a verdict of wilful murder by person or persons unknown. Tommy Pike was bound over to the assizes, though bail was granted on the colonel's surety. The hall emptied in a rustle of whispers and black bombazine. Outside, the rain had begun, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the lane to mud. Miss Marple lingered beneath the porch, adjusting her mackintosh. Dr. Haydock joined her, lighting a cigarette with cupped hands. "Well, that was a farce," he said. "Parks got his man, but the evidence wouldn't convict a cat of stealing cream." Miss Marple watched Tommy Pike being bundled into the colonel's motor by a solicitous maid. "The boy is innocent of everything but calf love," she said, though love has been known to make accomplices of the innocent. Haydock offered his umbrella. "Walk with me to the surgery? I've the post-mortem photographs. Gruesome, but you've a stronger stomach than most." They proceeded down the high street, past the shuttered shops and the post office where Mrs. Hargreaves was already relaying the inquest to a queue of customers. At the surgery, Haydock spread the photographs across his desk, the captain's head in profile, the wound a dark starburst against tanned skin, the paperweight sticky with gore, the teacup fragments arranged like a jigsaw no one wished to complete. Miss Marple studied them in silence. "The blow came from above and behind," she murmured. "A tall person, or one standing on the hearthrug while the captain bent forward, perhaps to pick up a dropped glove. The teacup was swept from the mantel by the same motion, but the saucer remained on the table. Curious. Park says the murderer snatched it up in passing, yet the saucer is undisturbed, and the fragments were scattered toward the chair, not away from it." She tapped a photograph. "Someone wished us to believe the cup fell with the body." Haydock exhaled smoke. "You're thinking of the secretary. Miss Pritchard is 5'3" in her stockings. She would need to reach considerably, or to stand on tiptoe. But observe the height of the mantel, 4'6" at least. The cup was placed near the edge, yes, but not precariously. A deliberate sweep, I think." She turned to the photograph of the paperweight. "And this?" Held in the captain's own hand, yet no blood on the palm. If he had clutched it after the blow, the grip would be smeared. Someone placed it there. Haydock crushed out his cigarette. "A planted weapon. But whose prints?" "Gloves, perhaps. Or a handkerchief. The captain's own, folded in his breast pocket. Monogrammed, I noticed. Easily borrowed and returned." A tap at the door heralded the surgery maid with a note. Haydock read it and frowned. "From the Manor. Miss Pritchard has given notice and left by the afternoon train. Destination unknown." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. How very prompt. One might almost say prepared. She gathered her knitting and rose. "Thank you, Doctor. You have been most helpful. I believe I shall take a turn past the station, purely for the air, you understand." The rain had eased to a mist as she walked the half-mile to Rose Hill Halt. The platform was deserted save for the station-master, Mr. Grout, who touched his cap. "Miss Marple, ma'am. Nasty business. That young woman, the secretary, bought a single to London Waterloo. Looked right peaky, she did. Dropped her glove getting into the carriage. Silk with a little pearl button. I picked it up, but the train was off." He produced the glove from his pocket, slightly muddied. Miss Marple examined it. Left hand, dainty. The button intact, but the seam at the thumb split as though pulled in haste. "May I?" she asked. Mr. Grout handed it over. Inside the cuff, in tiny embroidered script, were the initials E.P. Most obliging of her to leave a calling card, Miss Marple said softly. Back in her cottage, she laid the glove beside the captain's journal on the gate-legged table. The embroidered E matched the scrawled initial on the final page. She poured herself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, weak, no sugar, and considered the pattern emerging. A ruby, a debt, a woman who insisted on settlement by Friday, a teacup broken to mislead, a paperweight planted to incriminate, and a secretary who fled the village within hours of the inquest. Miss Marple opened her writing case and took out a sheet of Basildon bond. My dear Raymond, I hope this finds you and Joan in good health. I require a small service regarding a gem, possibly a ruby of Burmese origin, recently in the possession of a Captain R. Everett. Discreet inquiries at the London clubs, perhaps, or among the better sort of pawnbrokers. Nothing official. You understand. Your affectionate aunt, Jane. She sealed the letter, addressed it to her nephew in Whitehall, and placed it ready for the morning post. Outside, the church clock struck 6. Somewhere in London, a train was pulling into Waterloo, and a young woman in navy serge was stepping onto the platform with a suitcase and a secret. In Rose Hill, Tommy Pike slept uneasily in the Manor's best guest room, guarded by the Colonel's ancient bulldog. And Miss Marple, having wound her lavender wool into a neat ball, began a new row. The unseen hand had struck once. It would not, she thought, strike again without her noticing. Chapter 4. The Letter That Never Reached London. The following morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of autumn day that made Rose Hill look as though it had been polished overnight. Dew glittered on the village green, the baker's van left its usual fragrance of warm currant buns, and the postman, Mr. Willis, pedalled his red bicycle with the placid certainty that nothing in his sack could possibly matter as much as the murder everyone was discussing. Miss Marple was in her small front garden, clipping the last of the Michaelmas daisies, when he coasted to a stop at her gate. "Morning, miss. One for you. From London by the postmark." He handed over a thick cream envelope with a crest she recognized. Her nephew Raymond's club in St. James's. "And you're outgoing." He accepted the letter to Raymond, gave the murder a respectful nod, as though it were a personage to be acknowledged, and pedalled on. Inside, over a breakfast of toast and Cooper's Oxford marmalade, Miss Marple slit the envelope with a butter knife. "My dear Aunt Jane, your ruby proves elusive, but not unknown. A stone answering the description. Pigeon's blood, approx. 6 carats, old mine-cut, was offered to Messrs. H. & Son, Bond Street, in July by a Captain R. Everett. The firm declined. The captain appeared pressed, and left in ill humor. Yesterday I lunched with Tommy Hargreaves. You will recall his uncle in Burma. He confirms a similar ruby was lifted from a temple near Mandalay in 22 by a subaltern since cashiered. Name suppressed, but initials RE. More tonight if the clubs yield anything further. Joan sends love and begs you not to interrogate murderers without a policeman present. Your devoted, Raymond. Miss Marple folded the letter and slipped it into her cardigan pocket. A temple ruby, then, stolen, smuggled, and now the cause of a man's death in an English drawing-room. She finished her tea, rinsed the cup with the meticulous care she brought to all small rituals, and set out for the Manor. There were questions only the household could answer, and the household, she suspected, was in a mood to answer them. The Colonel himself opened the door. His face bristled with overnight growth and sleeplessness. "Miss Marple, good of you to come. The women are at 6s and 7s. Cook's given notice. Lydia's taken to bed." Again. "And the maids keep dropping things. Come in, come in." The morning room smelled of toast and eau de cologne. Mrs. Bantry reclined upon the same chaise, a breakfast tray untouched beside her. "I cannot think why Evelyn left so suddenly," she said fretfully. "One would almost suppose her conscience." "Conscience is a luxury few secretaries can afford," Miss Marple interposed gently. "Might I trouble you for a small thing, Mrs. Bantry? The captain's correspondence, anything he received in the last fortnight. One likes to be thorough." The Colonel grunted. Police took the lot, but there's a packet the maid found behind the linen press. Thought it rubbish. Women's scrawl mostly. He fetched a slim bundle tied with pale blue ribbon. Miss Marple untied it with care. 6 letters, all in the same neat hand, the paper faintly scented with orris root. My dear Ralph, the ruby must be returned by Friday, or I shall have no choice but to inform Colonel Bantry of the circumstances under which it left my possession. You promised marriage. You promised everything. I have waited long enough. E. The earlier letters grew progressively colder. The final one dated the morning of the garden party. I shall be in the drawing-room at 4. Bring the stone or prepare for consequences. Miss Marple refolded the letters. Mrs. Bantry, did you by any chance engage Miss Pritchard through an agency? The Domestic Bureau in Much Benham. Excellent references. Bishop's daughter, typewriter, shorthand, speaks French. Why? Merely dotting an I, Miss Marple said. And the ruby. Family, I take it. Mrs. Bantry's hand fluttered to her throat. Great-grandmamma's brooch, converted to a ring after Papa lost at Ascot. I kept it in the safe behind the Reynolds miniature. Evelyn had the combination. She paid the household bills. The Colonel exploded. You mean the girl had access to the safe? Only when I was indisposed. Which lately? Mrs. Bantry's voice trailed into a wince of self-reproach. Miss Marple rose. Colonel, might I see the safe? They proceeded to the library. The Reynolds miniature swung aside on silent hinges to reveal a small steel door. The Colonel twirled the combination. The safe was empty save for a velvet tray and an indentation the exact size of a gentleman's signet. Gone since Monday, he said grimly. Thought I'd mislaid it. Miss Marple's gaze travelled to the connecting door to the drawing-room. 4 o'clock. The household at tea, guests on the lawn, Miss Pritchard ostensibly fetching sandwiches. She enters here, opens the safe, removes the ruby, but the captain surprises her, demands it back. The Colonel finished. They argue. She snatches the paperweight. Yet the blow is from behind, Miss Marple reminded him, and the captain is seated, or made to appear so. No, Colonel, Miss Pritchard is clever, but not tall enough, nor, I think, violent enough. Someone else was in the room. She stepped through the connecting door. The drawing-room looked smaller by daylight, the chalk outline on the chair a macabre full stop. On the mantel, the dust ring of the teacup gaped like an eye. Observe, Miss Marple said. The fragments were swept toward the chair, yet the saucer remains on the table, 6 feet away. Someone wished us to believe the cup fell with the body, but it was thrown deliberately after the murder to create confusion. The Colonel scratched his head. Then who? A clamour in the hall interrupted him. Constable Polk burst in, helmet askew. Beg pardon, sir, but we've had a telephone message from Scotland Yard. A woman answering Miss Pritchard's description tried to pawn a ruby ring at Hatton Garden yesterday. Slipped away before the jeweller could detain her. They're circulating her photograph. Mrs. Bantry gave a small shriek. My ruby! Miss Marple was silent. A pawnshop, a fleeing secretary, a convenient scapegoat. It was almost too tidy. She thanked the Bantrys and took her leave. At the gate she paused to speak to Tommy Pike, who was disconsolately weeding the herbaceous border under the eye of the under-gardener. Tommy, on the afternoon of the party, did you carry anything from the potting shed to the house between 3:30 and 4? The boy straightened, wiping his brow. Only the new hose coil, miss. Miss Pritchard asked me to leave it just inside the library window. She said the Colonel wanted it for the rose arbor, but when I got there the window was shut, so I left it on the sill outside. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. And the old paperweight from the shed. The one Constable Polk found? Brass, heavy. Miss Pritchard borrowed it Tuesday to crack walnuts for the cook. Said the kitchen one was blunt. Thank you, Tommy. You have been most helpful. She walked on, her mind turning like a well-oiled clock. A hose coil on the sill. Something to trip a man hurrying from the library. A paperweight borrowed and returned, its twin left bloodied in a dead hand. A ruby removed days before the murder, yet the captain's journal spoke of settlement by Friday. At the post office she purchased a postal order and a sheet of notepaper. Mrs. Hargreaves, unable to contain herself, leaned over the counter. They say the secretary's in France by now, or South America. My cousin's boy in the yard says these modern girls. Miss Marple wrote steadily. Miss Evelyn Pritchard, CO Domestic Bureau, Much Benham. Dear Miss Pritchard, a small article of yours was found at Rosehill Holt. If you would call at Laburnum Cottage any afternoon this week, it shall be restored to you. Discretion assured, J. Marple. She paid for a stamp, affixed it, and handed the letter across. Mrs. Hargreaves's eyes widened like saucers, but Miss Marple offered only a mild smile. By luncheon, the village was aquiver with the news. From Hatton Garden. By tea-time, Constable Pauck had received a telegram. The woman in the photograph was not Evelyn Pritchard, but a milliner from Balham who had come by the ring honestly. The real Miss Pritchard had not been seen since boarding the London train. Miss Marple took tea in her sitting-room, the captain's journal open before her. She read again the final entry. E. insists on settlement. Must have the ruby by Friday or all is lost. Damn the woman. She closed the book and looked out at the garden, where the Michaelmas daisies nodded in the breeze. The woman, she thought, was not Evelyn. The initial was correct, but the hand was bolder, the slope more masculine. Someone had forged the letters, or some of them. She reached for her knitting. The lavender square grew row by row, each stitch a question, each pearl an answer forming. Somewhere in Rosehill a murderer believed the net was closing on a fleeing secretary. Somewhere a ruby glittered in a hiding place yet undiscovered. And somewhere, very soon, a trap would spring. Miss Marple counted her stitches, nodded satisfaction, and began a new row. Chapter 5. The Return of Miss Pritchard. The afternoon post on Thursday brought no reply from Evelyn Pritchard, but it did bring a picture postcard of Margate Pier, postmarked Waterloo, and addressed to Miss Marple in a hand she did not recognize. On the reverse, in hurried pencil, arrived safely. Will call Friday, 3 p.m. Grateful. E.P. Miss Marple turned the card over twice, noting the smudged thumbprint near the stamp and the faint scent of orris root that clung to the paper. She laid it beside the glove on her gate-legged table, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The fish had nibbled. Friday dawned blustery, with clouds scudding across the sky like sheep late for market. By 2:30, the village had settled into its usual rhythm, the butcher's boy whistling as he delivered chops to the vicarage, Mrs. Price Ridley taking her pug for a constitutional, Constable Pauck polishing his bicycle outside the police cottage and pretending not to watch Laburnum Cottage. Miss Marple set out her tea tray with care, a spode cup and saucer, no heirlooms today, a plate of Marie biscuits, a small silver pot cosily jacketed in quilted wool. She placed the glove and the postcard in full view, then took up her knitting, still the lavender square, now nearly large enough for a premature baby's shawl, and waited. At 3 o'clock precisely the garden gate clicked. Evelyn Pritchard stood on the path, a navy coat buttoned to the throat, a felt hat pulled low. She carried no suitcase, only a small beaded reticule. Her face was pale, the eyes shadowed, but the chin was firm. "Miss Marple, I believe you have something of mine." "Do come in, Miss Pritchard. The wind is sharp." Miss Marple closed the door behind her visitor and ushered her to the chair opposite the fireplace. "Tea?" "Thank you." The girl's voice was steady, but her fingers worried the clasp of the reticule. Miss Marple poured. "Milk? Sugar? 1 lump or 2? 2, please." Evelyn accepted the cup with both hands, as though warming them. "The glove. I dropped it in my haste. Foolish, but one panics." "Panic is a great betrayer of character," Miss Marple observed. "Some run, some invent, some—" She handed over the postcard. "Send misleading messages from railway stations." Evelyn's eyes flicked to the card, then away. "I needed time." "Time to do what, precisely?" Miss Marple's tone remained mild, but her gaze was keen. "To pawn a ruby that was never in your possession. To vanish so thoroughly that the police would close the file on Captain Everett's murder." The girl set the cup down with a clink. You think I killed him? I think you are in possession of facts that would discomfort the true murderer. That is often more dangerous than guilt. Miss Marple leaned forward. Tell me about the ruby, Miss Pritchard. The real ruby. Evelyn drew a breath that trembled only at the edges. It was never in the safe. Mrs. Bantry believed it was, but the captain had taken it weeks ago, said he needed to have it valued in London. He gave me the empty tray to return to the safe so she would not notice. I thought it a harmless deception. And the letters? Some were mine. Color rose in her cheeks. I was foolish. He promised marriage, a house in Kensington, all the usual things. When I discovered the ruby was stolen, temple loot, he laughed about it. I threatened to tell the colonel unless he returned it. That was the letter found in the grate. But the others... She opened the reticule and drew out a folded sheet. This came the morning of the party, pushed under my bedroom door. Miss Marple unfolded it. The same pale blue paper, the same neat hand. Draw him to the drawing room at 4. Leave the rest to me. The ruby will settle all debts, yours and his. Trust me as I trust you. L. Lydia Bantry, Miss Marple murmured. Evelyn nodded. I thought it a lover's intrigue. Jealousy over me, perhaps. I went to the drawing room at 20 to 4 to set the tea tray as usual. The captain was already there, pacing. He demanded the ruby. I told him I did not have it. He laughed, said Lydia would produce it or pay the price. Then he left by the library door. I finished arranging the tray and went out to the terrace. That was the last I saw of him alive. Miss Marple refolded the letter. And you fled because you believed yourself suspected. Constable Polk came to my room that night. He had the burned letter, the paperweight from the shed, my fingerprints because I had used it for walnuts. I thought if I vanished, the trail would end with me. A secretary is expendable. Yet you returned. Evelyn's smile was wintry. I discovered something on the train. In the captain's cigarette case. He left it in my keeping. For safekeeping. She opened the reticule again and produced a silver case, monogrammed R.E. Inside, nestled in the lid, was a compartment lined with purple velvet. Empty. The ruby was there, she said. He showed it to me once, by moonlight. Blood red, flawless. When I opened the case in the railway carriage, the stone was gone. Someone took it after the murder, while we were all on the lawn. Miss Marple turned the case in her hands. The hinge was loose. The velvet showed a faint circular impression. Taken by someone who knew exactly where to look. A silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the bracket clock. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes like an impatient visitor. You realize, Miss Marple said at last, that this places Miss Lydia in the gravest danger. If she has the ruby, or believes she has, the murderer will come for it. Evelyn's hands clenched. I came back to warn her. But if I go to the manor, Polk will arrest me on sight. Then we must arrange a safer meeting. Miss Marple rose. Wait here. I shall telephone Dr. Haydock. He has the colonel's ear and a discreet motor car. She stepped into the narrow hall and lifted the receiver. While she waited for the exchange, she studied the postcard again. Margate Pier, but the postmark was Waterloo and the pencil smudged as though written in haste on a moving train. A blind, perhaps, but to what end? Dr. Haydock arrived within 10 minutes, his Ostentura spluttering to a halt outside the gate. He listened to Evelyn's story with deepening gravity, then nodded. I'll take her to the manor by the back lane. The colonel's out with the hounds, but Mrs. Bantry will receive her in the morning room. You'll come, Miss Marple. I think not, Miss Marple said. 3 is a crowd when 2 are already frightened. But I shall walk as far as the Lich Gate. The air is bracing. They set off, Evelyn between the doctor and Miss Marple, the Austen crawling behind like a reluctant chaperone. At the churchyard, Miss Marple paused. One thing more, Miss Pritchard. The hose coil on the library sill. Did you ask Tommy Pike to leave it there? Evelyn shook her head. I never saw a hose coil. The library window was closed when I passed. Miss Marple watched the car disappear around the bend, then turned toward the church. The verger, Mr. Badger, was locking the vestry door. Afternoon, miss. Service tomorrow at 11. Harvest Festival practice tonight. Mr. Badger, on the day of the garden party, you heard voices through the library window. Were you certain both were in the room, or might one have been outside? The verger scratched his head. Come to think, the woman's voice was clearer, like she was nearer the window. The man's was muffled, farther in. Thank you. You have clarified a small point. Miss Marple continued homeward, her mind busy. A hose coil placed to trip a hurrying man. A woman's voice at the window. A cigarette case rifled while the body cooled. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but one corner remained obstinately blank. At Laburnum Cottage, she found a telegram pushed under the door. Stone offered again. Hatton Garden today. Woman tall fair, wearing grey. No arrest. Yard. Tall and fair. Not Evelyn Pritchard. Miss Marple lit the lamp, drew the curtains against the early dusk, and took out her notebook. In neat copperplate she wrote, Ruby removed by Captain E weeks ago. Empty tray returned to safe by EP. Forged letters in EP's hand planted to incriminate her. LB lures Captain to drawing room with promise of Ruby. Murderer strikes from behind, plants paperweight, breaks teacup to confuse. Ruby taken from cigarette case post-mortem. EP flees. LB attempts to sell stone in London. She underlined the last line twice. Lydia Bantry was 5'2" in her stockings. The church clock struck 6. Somewhere in Rosehill Manor, Evelyn Pritchard was telling her story to Mrs. Bantry, and Dr. Haydock was telephoning Scotland Yard. Somewhere a murderer believed the net was closing on a secretary who had never left the county. Miss Marple closed the notebook and reached for her knitting. The lavender square was nearly finished. Tomorrow she would begin the border. Like any good border, it would hold the center together and reveal the pattern at last. Outside, the wind dropped, and the village settled into the deceptive quiet that precedes a storm. Chapter 6. The Second Incident. Saturday brought a hard frost that turned the village roofs silver and made the cobbles treacherous. Miss Marple, wrapped in her old squirrel tippet, walked to the 8 o'clock service, her breath pluming like incense. St. Peter's was half empty. The Harvest Festival practice had been postponed out of respect for the murder, and only the devout or the curious braved the cold. She took her usual pew near the font, opened her prayer book, and appeared to listen to the vicar's sermon on the wages of sin. In truth, she was cataloguing faces. Mrs. Price Ridley in a new black hat that looked suspiciously like mourning, old Mr. Clement snoring gently in the Bantry pew, Tommy Pike, scrubbed and solemn, beside his mother. Lydia Bantry was absent. So was Evelyn Pritchard. After the final blessing, Miss Marple lingered to arrange the altar flowers, chrysanthemums from her own garden, bronze and gold. The verger hovered, eager for gossip. Miss Lydia's took to her bed again, he confided. Doctor's with her now. Hysteria, they say. And that secretary girl, staying at the manor like a guest. Colonel's orders. Miss Marple snipped a dead leaf. Kindness is often misunderstood, Mr. Badger. She left the church by the side door and took the footpath across the fields to the manor. The frost crackled underfoot. Rooks wheeled overhead, cawing disapproval. At the stile she paused. A motor bicycle leaned against the hedge, its engine ticking as it cooled. Dr. Haydock's borrowed from the garage in Much Benham. Something had happened. The back door stood ajar. Inside, the kitchen was chaos. Cook in tears, the scullery maid wringing her apron, Constable Peck red-faced and officious. Attempted murder, that's what it is, he bellowed. And this time we've got the villain. Miss Marple slipped past him into the hall. Dr. Haydock emerged from the morning room, his face grim. Miss Marple, good you're here. Lydia Bantry, nearly strangled in her bed not an hour ago. Evelyn Pritchard found her, raised the alarm. The girl's unconscious, but alive. Strangled? Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her fingers tightened on her prayer book. Silk scarf. Her own, from the dressing table. Knotted tight, then released when Evelyn burst in. Lydia's breathing now, but she's not spoken. Shock, probably. The colonel's telephoning for a specialist from Oxford. And Miss Pritchard? Upstairs with Mrs. Bantry. shaken but unharmed. Says she went to Lydia's room to bring breakfast, found the door locked, heard a gasp, forced the latch. Someone was bending over the bed, tall figure in a grey coat, fled through the window and down the ivy before Evelyn could scream. Miss Marple climbed the stairs. The upper corridor smelled of lavender water and fear. Mrs. Bantry sat on a chair outside Lydia's door, a vinaigrette in one hand, the other clutching Evelyn's wrist. "Oh, Miss Marple, my poor niece. First Ralph, now this. Who can want her dead?" "Someone who believes she possesses the ruby," Miss Marple said, "or who wishes us to believe it." She entered the bedroom. Lydia lay against the pillows, her face waxen, a bruise blooming dark across her throat. The window stood open. Ivy leaves trembled in the draught. On the carpet lay the scarf, pale blue silk, knotted and twisted like a snake. Evelyn stood by the bed, her eyes fixed on the window. "I saw the coat," she whispered. "Grey, long, with a hood. A woman, I think, but tall. She climbed down the ivy as though she'd done it before." Miss Marple examined the scarf. The knot was a sailor's bend, simple, strong, easily loosened. "Not intended to kill," she murmured. "A warning. Or a rehearsal." She moved to the window. The ivy was thick, but several stems were freshly broken. A scrap of grey wool clung to a thorn. Below, footprints led across the frozen lawn toward the orchard. Long, narrow, a man's stride or a tall woman's. Downstairs, Constable Polk had assembled the household in the drawing room. The colonel paced like a caged bear. "Locked room, window open, footprints, clear as day. The Pritchard girl's in it up to her neck. Probably let her accomplice in through the kitchen." Evelyn flushed. "I was in the kitchen from 7 o'clock helping cook with the porridge. Ask anyone." Cook corroborated, sniffling into her apron. The maids agreed. Miss Pritchard had been stirring oats when the scream came from upstairs. Polk was undeterred. "Then she locked the door from inside, climbed down the ivy, came back round?" "Leaving the door locked behind her?" Dr. Haydock asked dryly. "Come, Constable, even a cat burglar would struggle with that." Miss Marple entered quietly. "The door was forced from the corridor side, I believe. The latch is splintered. And the scarf, knotted but not tightened fully. Someone wished Miss Lydia alive but frightened." She held up the scrap of grey wool. "From the intruder's coat. Size 12 needle, hand-knitted, not shop-bought." Mrs. Price Ridley, who had arrived breathless with the news, gave a small shriek. "My sister-in-law knits with that wool. She sent me a skein last Michaelmas. Storm cloud grey, she called it." Miss Marple turned to her. "And who, pray, has borrowed your knitting of late?" Mrs. Price Ridley's mouth opened, closed. "Why, Miss Lydia herself. She admired my bed jacket and asked to try the pattern. Took the wool and the needles. Said she'd return them when finished." The room stilled. Colonel Bantry stopped pacing. "Lydia knitting her own noose?" he muttered. "Impossible." "Not impossible," Miss Marple said. "Merely staged. The scarf from her drawer, the wool from her work-basket, the footprints." She crossed to the French windows and pointed to the lawn. "See how they begin abruptly 10 feet from the house? Someone walked backward in larger boots, brushing the frost with a besom to obscure the true direction. The ivy was climbed from below, not above." Dr. Haydock followed her gaze. "By God, you're right. The broken stems are bent outward. Polk deflated like a punctured balloon." "Then who—" "The person who knew Miss Pritchard would be blamed," Miss Marple said. "Who knew the ruby was missing, the letters forged, the secretary fled. Someone who wished to silence Lydia before she recovered her wits." She turned to Evelyn. "Miss Pritchard, when you entered the room, was anything out of place besides the scarf?" Evelyn frowned. "The jewel box on the dressing table. It was open. I'd seen Lydia lock it last night. She said it held her mother's pearls." The colonel strode upstairs, returning moments later with a small morocco case. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay a ruby ring, pigeon's blood, flawless, catching the light like a drop of fresh blood. Mrs. Bantry gasped. "But that's my ring. I thought it stolen." "It was," Miss Marple said. Returned this morning by someone who wished it discovered. A gift to incriminate, not to restore. She took the ring, turning it to the window. On the inner shank, almost invisible, was engraved, "To E. from R. Mandalay, 1922. Captain Everett's gift to his accomplice," she said softly. "Planted here to suggest Lydia killed him for it, then tried to kill herself in remorse. But Lydia is 5'2". The footprints are size 9. And the engraving, E, not L." The colonel's face darkened. "Then who the devil is E?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she addressed Polk. "Constable, telephone Scotland Yard. Ask them to trace a tall woman, fair, wearing a grey coat, seen in Hatton Garden yesterday, and inquire whether a motor bicycle was hired in Much Benham this morning." Polk bustled off. Miss Marple returned the ring to its case. "Doctor, might I trouble you for a lift to the village? I have an errand at the post office." In the Austin, as they bumped down the lane, Haydock glanced at her. "You know who it is." "I know who it must be," Miss Marple corrected. "The pieces fit, though one is still missing. A woman scorned, a ruby promised, a murder to conceal an older crime, but we must catch her in the act, or she will vanish like smoke." At the post office, she purchased a sheet of blue writing paper and an envelope. Mrs. Hargreaves watched avidly. "Another letter, Miss Marple?" "To London." "To the Manor," Miss Marple said, writing swiftly. "Miss Lydia Bantry, Rose Hill Manor." "My dear, the ruby is unsafe in the house. Bring it to Laburnum Cottage at 4 o'clock. I have a buyer who will pay cash and ask no questions. Come alone. Trust no one. E." She sealed it, paid for special delivery, and handed it over. Mrs. Hargreaves's eyes bulged. "But that's exactly what someone wishes to believe," Miss Marple finished. "By 4 o'clock, Constable, I suggest you have men in the lane and the churchyard. Unobtrusively." She stepped outside. The frost was melting. Rooks wheeled lower. At the corner she met Tommy Pike, carrying a bundle of bean sticks. "Tommy, do you still have the key to the potting shed?" "Yes, miss. Colonel said to keep it locked till the police are done." "Excellent. Leave it under the 3rd flower pot on the left at 3:30. There's a good lad." Tommy touched his cap and went on, puzzled but obedient. Miss Marple walked homeward, her mind clear as the winter sky. The trap was baited. A forged note in Evelyn's hand, a ruby that would draw the murderer like a moth to flame. This time there would be no locked room, no convenient scapegoat. At Laburnum Cottage she prepared tea for one, set the ruby in a saucer on the gate-legged table, and waited. The clock ticked toward 4. Outside, the village held its breath. At 10 minutes to the hour, a tall figure in a grey coat appeared at the gate, hood shadowed, stride purposeful. The garden path crunched under purposeful boots. The door opened without a knock. Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Good afternoon, Miss Everett. I believe you are expected." The hood fell back. The face was handsome, hardened by sun and disappointment. Captain Everett's sister, Eleanor, lately arrived from India to claim her brother's legacy. In her gloved hand glinted the missing paperweight from the shed. "Old woman," she said softly, "you should have left well alone." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice. "On the contrary, my dear, I have been waiting for you." From the lane came the whistle of Constable Polk, the crash of boots through the hedge. Eleanor Everett spun, but the door was already filling with blue uniforms. The paperweight clattered to the floor. Miss Marple rose, serene. "Eleanor Everett, I arrest you for the murder of Captain Ralph Everett and the attempted murder of Miss Lydia Bantry." The rest was lost in the scuffle. Miss Marple retrieved the ruby, slipped it into her pocket, and poured herself a fresh cup of tea. The lavender square was finished. Tomorrow she would begin something larger. Outside, the rooks settled back into the elms, and Rosehill exhaled. Chapter 7. The Trap. Snaps shut. The drawing-room at Laburnum Cottage had never seen such a gathering. By 4:30, the small space was crowded. Constable Polk, helmet tucked beneath his arm like a captured trophy. 2 plainclothesmen from Scotland Yard, their London shoes still dusty from the train. Dr. Haydock, medical bag at the ready. Colonel Bantry, moustache bristling with indignation. and seated on the sofa with a blanket round her shoulders, Evelyn Pritchard, pale but composed. Lydia Bantry had been left at the manor under the care of a nurse, and Mrs. Bantry's sal volatile. In the centre of the rug stood Eleanor Everett, wrists in handcuffs, the grey coat unbuttoned to reveal a travelling dress of severe cut. Her fair hair had escaped its pins. Her eyes, the same hard blue as her brother's, flicked from face to face with the calculation of a cornered animal. Miss Marple sat in her usual armchair, the ruby ring glinting on a crocheted doily beside the tea-tray. Her knitting lay folded, the lavender square complete. She regarded the prisoner with the mild interest one might give a troublesome beetle. "Miss Everett," she began, "you have made several miscalculations, but the gravest was underestimating the village postmistress. Mrs. Hargreaves recognized your handwriting on the postcard from Waterloo. She once received a complaint from you about your brother's laundry. A small thing, but villages remember." Eleanor's lip curled. "Old women and their tittle-tattle." "Old women notice," Miss Marple corrected gently. "You arrived in Rosehill on the morning of the garden party, travelling by motor bicycle from Much Benham. You left the machine at the stile, entered the manor grounds through the orchard, and waited in the library. Your brother had telegraphed you in London, begging for money, no doubt, to settle his debt over the ruby." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Everett never mentioned a sister." "He wouldn't," Eleanor said bitterly. "I was the family disgrace. Sent down from Somerville, married a tea planter who drank himself to death in Assam. Ralph promised to buy me a passage home if I brought him the cash he needed. Instead, he sent a ruby stolen from a Burmese temple. I came to collect what was mine. Miss Marple poured tea. No one accepted," and continued. "You knew the manor's layout from your brother's letters. At 4:20 you watched Evelyn Pritchard leave the drawing-room. You entered from the library, confronted Ralph. He laughed, said the ruby was already pawned, the money spent. You argued. He turned to the window to summon Lydia, whom he believed still had the stone. You picked up the paperweight." "I didn't mean to kill him," Eleanor said flatly. "Only to stun him, make him listen. But he fell awkwardly, struck his head on the fender. Blood everywhere. I panicked." Dr. Haydock nodded. "The angle of the wound, consistent with a fall after a glancing blow." "You placed the paperweight in his hand," Miss Marple resumed, broke the teacup to suggest a struggle, and searched his pockets. The cigarette case yielded the ruby. Then you heard voices on the terrace, Evelyn returning with the sandwich tray. You slipped back to the library, climbed out the window, and coiled the hose on the sill to trip anyone pursuing. Tommy Pike's errand gave you the idea. Eleanor shrugged. Ralph always said servants were useful idiots. You left the motor bicycle at the stile, walked to Much Benham, and caught the London train. But you needed the crime pinned elsewhere. You forged letters in Evelyn's hand, easy enough with samples from the typewriter in the morning room, and planted them for the police. You sent Evelyn the note signed L, to lure her to the drawing-room at 4, knowing she would be blamed. Evelyn stirred. I burned the note, but not thoroughly. I was afraid to keep it. Quite right, Miss Marple said. Fear makes us careful, or careless. Miss Everett counted on the latter. The taller of the Scotland Yard men, Inspector Craddock, introduced earlier, spoke for the first time. "And the attack on Miss Lydia Bantry?" Eleanor's eyes glittered. "The little fool had the ruby after all. Oh, so I thought. Ralph's last letter from Southampton said he'd hidden it in her jewel box for safekeeping. I returned this morning, hired the same motor bicycle, entered by the orchard again. The house was quiet, everyone at church or in the kitchen. I climbed the ivy to Lydia's room, found the ring, left it in plain sight. Then I thought, why not finish the job? One more death, blamed on the secretary, and I'd be clear." She had knotted the scarf, tightened it just enough to terrify, then heard Evelyn on the stairs. I released the knot, climbed down, walked backward in the Colonel's gardening boots to lay a false trail. Clever, I thought. Clever, Miss Marple echoed, but not clever enough. The grey coat was seen in Hatton Garden yesterday, trying to sell the ruby before you planted it. The wool matched Mrs. Price Ridley's gift to Lydia. And the motorbicycle, Mr. Grout at the garage remembered a tall lady with an army dispatch rider's accent. Colonel Bantry exploded. You used my boots? My ivy? Dash it, woman, have you no decency? Decency, Eleanor said, is a luxury for those who can afford it. Inspector Craddock snapped his notebook shut. Eleanor Everett, you will accompany us to Much Benham. Charges: murder of Captain Ralph Everett, attempted murder of Miss Lydia Bantry, theft of a ruby ring valued at... He was interrupted by a commotion in the hall. The door burst open to admit Mrs. Price Ridley, hat askew, clutching a telegram. Miss Marple, from London. Raymond Marple, Esquire. Sees the ruby is paste. A copy made in Hatton Garden last month. The real stone was sold to an American in Bombay 6 weeks ago. The room fell silent. Eleanor Everett stared at the ring on the doily, then laughed. A harsh, cracked sound. All this, she said, for a piece of red glass. Miss Marple picked up the ring, held it to the light. Captain Everett was always a gambler. He sold the Temple ruby, commissioned a paste copy to placate his creditor, you, Miss Everett, and planned to flee with the proceeds. When you demanded the real stone, he substituted the forgery. You killed him for a bauble. Eleanor's laughter died. The fight went out of her like air from a punctured tire. Inspector Craddock signaled to his sergeant, "Take her away." As the prisoner was led out, Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, I don't know how to thank you. Dash clever, the whole thing. Owe you a dinner at the Crown. Best claret in the county." Miss Marple smiled. "A cup of tea will suffice, Colonel, and perhaps the return of your gardening boots." Dr. Haydock chuckled. "I'll drive you home, Miss M. You've earned a rest." But Miss Marple lingered, turning the paste ruby in her fingers. "One small matter remains. The real stone is in Bombay, but the money from its sale, where is that?" Evelyn Pritchard spoke for the first time since the arrest. "In a post office savings account under the name of Mrs. Ralph Everett. He showed me the book the night before he died, said it was for our honeymoon." The colonel's face purpled. "The scoundrel!" "Human nature," Miss Marple said softly, "is rarely scrupulous where love and money meet. But the account will be frozen now, and the young lady," she inclined her head toward Evelyn, "will have learned that promises are not always kept." Evelyn's eyes filled. "I was a fool." "We are all fools in youth," Miss Marple said. "The fortunate ones recover." Outside, the frost had melted. The garden dripped like a thawing ice cake. The Scotland Yard motor car crunched away down the lane, taking Eleanor Everett to justice. Villagers gathered at gates, mouths agape, as the news spread faster than telegraph wires. Miss Marple accepted Dr. Haydock's arm for the short walk home. At her gate she paused. "Doctor, might I trouble you to post a parcel? The lavender square is finished, for the Women's Institute sale, though I fear it will fetch only 6pence. Haydock took the neatly wrapped package. "After today, Miss M., you could auction it for a guinea, and no one would blink." She watched him drive off, then entered her cottage. The fire was laid, the kettle sang. She set the paste ruby on the mantel beside a photograph of her nephew Raymond. Young, earnest, quite unaware of the drama his telegram had concluded. Human nature, she reflected, was a tapestry of greed, folly, and occasional redemption. She had unraveled one thread. The pattern remained. Upstairs, she opened her wardrobe and took down a length of rose-pink wool. Something larger this time, a shawl perhaps for the vicar's wife who was expecting in the spring. Downstairs, the kettle boiled. Miss Marple made tea, cut a slice of seed cake, and sat by the window to watch the village settle into evening. Somewhere a church bell rang for evensong. Somewhere a murderer travelled toward judgment. And in Laburnum Cottage the knitting needles began their quiet, inevitable click. Chapter 8. Secrets Revealed. The village of Rosehill, for all its outward calm, was never quite the same after the events of that frost-bitten Saturday. By Monday morning the arrest of Eleanor Everett had become legend. retold over garden walls, embroidered in the post office queue, and dissected at the Women's Institute with the solemnity usually reserved for harvest yields. The paste ruby, now locked in Constable Polk's desk drawer as evidence, had transformed from a symbol of tragedy into a curiosity, like a relic from a forgotten war. Miss Marple, however, had returned to her routine with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener who has pruned a troublesome shrub. She rose at 7, watered the greenhouse seedlings, and took her customary walk to the high street to purchase sprats for supper. The air was sharp with the promise of winter. The Michaelmas daisies had given way to the first brave crocuses pushing through the soil like tentative confessions. At the fishmonger's she encountered Mrs. Price Ridley, whose hat today sported a feather that trembled with every syllable. "Miss Marple, I declare I scarce slept a wink. To think we had a murderess in our midst, and a forger, though between you and me that Everett girl always did have a look of the stage about her. Somerville, indeed." Miss Marple accepted her paper-wrapped parcel. "Education is no guarantee of character, Mrs. Price Ridley, though it does provide one with better vocabulary for excuses." The feather quivered in agreement. By 11 o'clock Miss Marple was seated in the Manor's morning room, summoned by a note from Mrs. Bantry, delivered by the under gardener. The room smelled of beeswax and nervous anticipation. Mrs. Bantry reclined upon the chaise, a fresh bottle of sal volatile at her elbow. Lydia, pale but upright, sat beside her aunt in a dressing-gown of quilted silk. Evelyn Pritchard, in a neat grey frock that matched her eyes, stood by the window twisting a handkerchief. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat like a man about to address troops. "Miss Marple, we are in your debt. Dashed awkward business, but you've cleared the innocent and collared the guilty. The yard chaps say the case is closed. Paste ruby, real murder, all accounted for. But there's the matter of the money. Everett's post office book, £500, deposited in Lydia's name as Mrs. R. Everett. The bank won't release it without clarity." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Captain Everett intended it as a bridal portion, I believe, though bigamy would have complicated the wedding breakfast." Lydia flushed crimson. "I never agreed to marry him. He said it was a loan, to buy a motor car for our honeymoon. I was to sign the book as his wife to keep it from his creditors. I thought it romantic." Mrs. Bantry gave a small shriek. "Romantic! The scoundrel planned to make you an accessory to fraud." "Youth," Miss Marple said mildly, "often mistakes adventure for affection. The money will revert to the estate. Captain Everett's creditors in India will claim most of it, I fear. But there may be a small sum for Miss Pritchard, whose typewriter ribbons and postage stamps were used without recompense." Evelyn's eyes widened. "I want nothing of his." "Very proper," Miss Marple approved. "Though a reference from Mrs. Bantry will serve you better than guineas. The domestic bureau has already telephoned. Another position in Tunbridge Wells, with a dowager who keeps parrots." Mrs. Bantry dabbed her eyes. "I shall miss you, Evelyn. You were the only secretary who never misplaced my migraine powders." The colonel produced a checkbook. "And for you, Miss Marple, something for the church restoration fund, eh? Can't have the tower falling on the vicar's head." Miss Marple waved it away. "The fund is in excellent health, Colonel, though if you insist, a donation to the district nurse would not go amiss. She is expecting her third, and the pram is quite worn." The colonel grunted agreement and tore up the cheque in favor of a larger one made out to the Nursing Association. Lydia leaned forward. "There is one thing I don't understand, Miss Marple. The teacup. Why break it at all?" "A distraction," Miss Marple explained. "Eleanor Everett wished us to believe the murder spontaneous. A quarrel, a struggle. A broken heirloom suggests passion. A neat blow from behind suggests calculation. She broke the cup with the paperweight after the captain was dead, then placed the weapon in his hand to imply self-defense or accident. The scattered fragments pointed toward the body, not away. Another small miscalculation." Mrs. Bantry shuddered. "My pudor. Grandmother's cup. Though I suppose paste rubies and paste sentiments go together." Miss Marple rose. "Sentiment is rarely paste, Mrs. Bantry. Only the objects we pin it to. She took her leave, pausing in the hall to admire the Reynolds miniature. The safe behind it stood open. Inside lay a new velvet tray, empty but expectant. Human nature, she reflected, would fill it again soon enough. Outside, the garden was being put to bed for winter. Tommy Pike raking leaves into fragrant piles. The undergardener pruning the rose arbor where Captain Everett had once spun tales of tigers. Tommy touched his cap. "Morning, miss. Colonel says I'm to have the head gardener's cottage when old Mr. Jenkins retires, on account of me not being a murderer after all." Miss Marple smiled. "An excellent recommendation, Tommy. And Miss Lydia, does she still walk in the herb garden?" The boy's ears turned pink. "She asked me to show her how to force hyacinths for Christmas. Said she fancies blue ones." "Blue is a hopeful colour," Miss Marple said, and continued down the drive. At the lich gate she met Dr. Haydock, his motor bicycle propped against the wall. "Thought I'd find you here," he said. "The inquest on Everett is tomorrow. Formality now. Eleanor's confessed everything except the exact spot she hid the motor bicycle between visits. Stubborn to the last. Pride," Miss Marple said, "is the hardest weed to eradicate. It grows even in handcuffs." Haydock offered her a lift. She declined. The walk home was short, and she wished to call at the vicarage. The vicar's wife, round as a cottage loaf, was delighted with the rose-pink wool. "For the baby's shawl. How kind, though with my figure I shall need two." Miss Marple promised another skein and took her leave. At Laburnum Cottage she found a parcel on the doorstep. Brown paper, string, no note. Inside was the brass paperweight from the gardener's shed, scrubbed clean, and a slip of paper in the colonel's impatient scrawl. "For your nephew's desk. Souvenir of a near thing." She set it on the mantel beside the photograph of Raymond, where it caught the light like a small malevolent sun. That evening the village held an impromptu meeting in the parish hall. The Harvest Festival Committee, deprived of practice by murder, had decided to celebrate its resolution instead. Tables groaned with plum cake, sausage rolls, and a towering trifle contributed by cook in a fit of relief. Constable Polk, promoted to sergeant by a grateful chief constable, made a speech about vigilance and village spirit. Mrs. Price Ridley proposed a vote of thanks to Miss Marple, who accepted with a murmur and a slice of Victoria sponge. Lydia Bantry, escorted by Tommy Pike in his Sunday suit, presented Miss Marple with a small posy of forest violets tied with blue ribbon. "For saving my life," she whispered, "and for not telling Aunt about the hyacinths." Miss Marple tucked the posy into her handbag. "Secrets are like bulbs, my dear. They keep best in the dark until ready to flower." The evening ended with community singing, "Jerusalem, all things bright and beautiful," and at Mrs. Price Ridley's insistence, "Rule Britannia." Miss Marple's voice was soft but true. She had always liked the line about the heavenly shore. Later, walking home under a sky pricked with stars, she reflected on the week's revelations. Greed had worn the mask of love, desperation, the cloak of respectability. Yet beneath the masks, people remained stubbornly human, capable of murder, yes, but also of cakes, violets, and second chances. At her gate she paused. The paste ruby, returned by Scotland Yard as worthless, lay in her pocket wrapped in tissue. She would post it anonymously to a mission in Burma, let it fund a schoolroom or a well. Even false gems could do true good. Inside she lit the lamp, wound the clock, and took out her knitting. The rose-pink shawl grew row by row, each stitch a small act of faith in the coming spring. Outside, Rose Hill slept. The manor's windows glowed, the church clock struck 10, and in the quiet cottage, Miss Jane Marple knitted on, her mind already turning to the next small irregularity in the pattern of village life. For in villages, as in hearts, secrets never stayed buried long. Chapter 9. The Weight of the Past. The week following Eleanor Everett's arrest settled over Rose Hill like a quilt stitched from gossip and relief. The village had its villain, its heroine, And thanks to the paste ruby, its morale, sermons were preached on the vanity of earthly treasures. The Women's Institute debated whether to include the story in the parish history, tastefully anonymized, of course, and Constable Polk, now Sergeant Polk, patrolled the high street with the solemn gait of a man who had single-handedly prevented Rosehill from becoming the crime capital of the county. Miss Marple, however, found herself restless. The case was closed, the murderer dispatched to Oxford jail to await trial, yet a small persistent thread tugged at the edge of her mind. It was not doubt. Eleanor's confession had been thorough, but something older, like the faint scent of mothballs in a drawer one has forgotten to air. On Wednesday morning she received a letter postmarked Bombay, the envelope thick and official, the handwriting precise. Laburnum Cottage, Rosehill, Gloucestershire. Dear Miss Marple, I trust this finds you in robust health. My name is Major Arthur Blaine, late of the 14th Bengal Lancers, retired. Your nephew Raymond, capital fellow, suggested I write. The ruby you so cleverly exposed as paste has stirred memories here. The original stone was lifted from the Shwezagon Pagoda in 22 by a subaltern named Everett. The priests never forgot. The curse, they say, follows the thief and his blood. I enclose a photograph taken at the Mandalay Club, 1923. Note the ring on the lady's finger. She was Everett's fiancée then, tall, fair, educated at Somerville. The engagement ended badly. She returned to England in disgrace. The ruby vanished with her. If this aids your inquiries, I am glad. Burma remembers. Yours sincerely, Arthur Blaine, Major Rete. The photograph showed a younger Eleanor Everett, defiant in evening dress, the ruby blazing on her hand. Miss Marple studied it for a long moment, then slipped it into the drawer with the brass paperweight. The past, she reflected, was a patient creditor. That afternoon she walked to the manor, her marketing basket over her arm as camouflage. The frost had given way to mild, damp air. The rose arbor dripped mournfully. Tommy Pike was repairing the trellis, his sleeves rolled high. Afternoon, miss. Colonel's in the gun-room, cleaning his 12 bores for the shoot. Miss Lydia's in the conservatory, forcing them hyacinths. Miss Marple found Lydia among the potted bulbs, her cheeks flushed from the stove's heat. The girl looked up, startled, then smiled with the shy gratitude of one still measuring the distance between life and death. I wanted to thank you again, she said. Aunt says I'm to go to Switzerland in the spring, finish my education, though I'd rather stay and learn gardening from Tommy. Switzerland will teach you poise, Miss Marple said. Tommy will teach you patience. Both are useful. She set her basket on the bench. My dear, when Captain Everett gave you the post office book, did he ever mention a sister? Lydia frowned. Only once. Said she was a dragon in petticoats who'd stolen his heart and his allowance at Oxford. I thought it a joke. Dragons, Miss Marple murmured. Rarely jest. She left the conservatory and proceeded to the gun-room. Colonel Bantry was oiling a Purdy, his face ruddy with concentration. Miss Marple, come to inspect the artillery? Dashed fine pieces. My father bagged Tiger with this one in 98. Fascinating, Miss Marple said. Colonel, the safe behind the Reynolds. When was it installed? 95. My governor had it put in after a burglary in Much Benham. Combinations the year of Waterloo, 1815. Family tradition. And who knew the combination before Miss Pritchard? The colonel scratched his head. Mrs. B, of course, and young Ralph. He stayed here in 23 after his Burmese leave. Needed a loan, said his sister had cleaned him out at poker. I let him stash his dress studs in the safe. Never thought he'd pinch the ruby. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. 1923, the year the stone vanished from Mandalay. She thanked the colonel and took her leave, pausing in the hall to examine the Reynolds miniature. The painted eyes of a long-dead Bantry ancestor seemed to follow her, a reminder that family secrets, like rubies, were often passed down whether one wished it or not. At the post office, she posted a brief note to Major Blaine. Photograph. Received. Curse fulfilled. Grateful. And purchased a reel of darning wool. Mrs. Hargreaves leaned over the counter. "They say Eleanor Everett's to be hanged, though with her education perhaps they'll reprieve her." "Education," Miss Marple said, "is no passport to mercy. Only remorse earns that." Back home, she opened her notebook and added a final entry. 8. A ruby stolen by Eleanor E. in Burma, 1922, given to brother as pledge. Returned to England 1923, hidden in manor safe. Captain E. restole it 1925 to sell in Bombay. Pay substitute commission to deceive sister. Cycle complete. She closed the book, satisfied. The thread was tied. That evening Dr. Haydock called, his motor bicycle coughing to a stop outside the gate. "Thought you'd like to know. Lydia's throat is healing nicely, no permanent damage, and Evelyn's off to Tunbridge Wells tomorrow. The Dowager's parrots are apparently fluent in Shakespeare." Miss Marple poured cocoa. "Parrots and dowagers, a fitting penance for misplaced trust." Haydock accepted the cup. "You've been quiet since the arrest. No loose ends." "Only one," Miss Marple said. "The curse. Major Blaine believes the priest's malediction followed the ruby. Eleanor killed her brother. The stone was paste, justice was served. Yet curses are less about gems than guilt." She opened the drawer and showed him the photograph. Haydock whistled. "So she had it first. Explains the fury." "Fury fermented for 3 years," Miss Marple said. "She came to Rosehill not for money but for vengeance, on the brother who betrayed her, the village that sheltered him, the girl he planned to marry with her stolen ruby. The paste was the final insult." Haydock set down his cup. "And you? Did the curse touch you?" Miss Marple smiled. "My dear doctor, I deal in human nature, not superstition. Though I shall send the paste ruby to the Shwezigon Pagoda all the same. Even false gods deserve restitution." She saw him out, then returned to the fireside. The rose-pink shawl was nearly finished. She worked a border of lace. Delicate, intricate. A pattern she had learned from her grandmother. Each stitch was a small act of order in a disordered world. Outside, the church clock struck 9. Somewhere in Oxford jail, Eleanor Everett paced a narrow cell, her Somerville education useless against the hangman's rope. Somewhere in Tunbridge Wells, Evelyn Pritchard unpacked her typewriter and prepared to transcribe the memoirs of a dowager who believed Macbeth was a comedy. Somewhere in Switzerland, Lydia Bantry would learn to ski and forget the taste of fear. And in Laburnum Cottage, Miss Marple knitted on, the firelight flickering across the brass paperweight and the photograph of a younger, fiercer woman who had once held a cursed ruby to the light. The past was settled. The present was peaceful. And the future, well, the future would bring its own small murders, its own broken teacups. Miss Marple counted her stitches, nodded, and began the final row. Chapter 10. The Final Trap. The trial of Eleanor Everett was set for the spring assizes in Oxford, but long before the black cap was donned or the jury sworn, Rosehill had folded the affair into its collective memory like a pressed flower between the pages of the parish magazine. The paste ruby had been parcelled off to Burma, the brass paperweight graced Raymond's desk in Whitehall, and the Manor's safe, combination unchanged since Waterloo, held nothing more sinister than Mrs. Bantry's seed pearls and the Colonel's war medals. Yet Miss Marple, for all her outward serenity, felt the case unfinished. A single letter, tucked into the drawer with Major Blaine's photograph, had arrived the previous day. It was written on cheap blue stationery, the ink smudged as though by rain or tears. Laburnum Cottage, Rosehill. You think it ended with the sister. It did not. The ruby was never the prize. Ask the Colonel what he buried in the rose arbor the night Everett died. Ask why the dogs did not bark. One who knows no signature. The postmark, Much Benham. The day after the arrest. Miss Marple read it twice, then carried it to the mantel and laid it beside the now empty space where the paperweight had stood. She had learned long ago that anonymous letters were rarely anonymous to the attentive eye. The slant of the G, the flourish on the Y. These were signatures in themselves. On a morning bright with winter sun, she walked to the manor, her marketing basket swinging like a pendulum. The rose arbor had been dismantled for repairs. Tommy Pike was digging a trench for new posts, his breath puffing white. "Morning, miss. Colonel says we're to plant climbers. Clematis, maybe. Something that flowers twice." Miss Marple paused. "A good choice, Tommy. Roots that cling, blossoms that return. Tell me, on the night Captain Everett died, after the garden party, did you hear the dogs?" Tommy leaned on his spade. "Funny you should ask. Bruno and Bess usually kick up a fuss at strangers, but that night they never stirred. I thought it odd, but with the murder and all." He resumed digging. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the trench. The soil was dark, rich, recently turned. At the bottom lay a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. "Tommy, might I borrow your trowel a moment?" He handed it over, puzzled. Miss Marple knelt. Her knees protested but obeyed, and eased the bundle free. Inside was a leather pouch, heavy for its size. She opened it. Coins glinted. Sovereigns, 20 in all, tarnished but unmistakable. The colonel's voice boomed from the terrace. "Miss Marple, what the devil are you doing in my rose bed?" She rose, the pouch in her hand. "Unearthing a small debt, Colonel. From 1923, I believe." The colonel's face drained of color. Mrs. Bantry appeared behind him, shawl clutched tight. "Arthur," she whispered, "tell me it isn't." He strode down the steps, took the pouch, and weighed it in his palm. "Dash it all. I thought it buried forever." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Captain Everett borrowed these sovereigns from you in 1923 to buy silence after his sister stole the ruby. He promised repayment with interest in the form of the stone itself. When he sold the real ruby in Bombay and substituted paste, he kept the sovereigns. You discovered the switch the night of the garden party, confronted him in the arbor after the guests had gone. He laughed, said the debt was cancelled by his death. You struck him in anger, then carried the body to the drawing room to make it appear an intruder's work." The colonel's shoulders sagged. "I never meant murder. He was drunk, mocking. Said I'd harbored a thief and a forger. The spade was in my hand from the rose supports. One blow. He fell. I panicked." Mrs. Bantry gave a small, stricken cry. Tommy Pike stood frozen, trowel dangling. Miss Marple continued. "You broke the teacup to suggest a struggle, planted the paperweight from the shed, knowing Tommy's fingerprints were on it. You buried the sovereigns to hide the motive. The dogs did not bark because they knew their master." The colonel nodded dully. "Eleanor arrived the next morning, saw the body, assumed I'd killed him for the ruby. She finished the staging, forged the letters, attacked Lydia to silence her. I let her take the blame. Cowardice, pure and simple." He looked at Miss Marple, eyes pleading. "What now?" "Now," she said, "you will come with me to Sergeant Polk. The truth will commute Eleanor's sentence, manslaughter perhaps, or accessory after the fact. And you will face your own reckoning." Mrs. Bantry wept silently. Tommy Pike began to fill the trench, his movements mechanical. At the police cottage, Sergeant Polk listened in stunned silence as the colonel confessed. The sovereigns were counted, the spade produced from the tool shed, its edge still bearing a faint rust-brown stain. By evening, Scotland Yard had been telephoned. Eleanor Everett was removed from the condemned cell to await a new trial. Miss Marple walked home through the dusk. The village lamps flickered on one by one, casting pools of gold on the cobbles. At Laburnum Cottage she lit her own lamp, drew the curtains, and took out her notebook. The final entry was brief. 9. True motive. Dead of honor, 1923. Colonel B. struck fatal blow. Eleanor E. concealed, believing Ruby the cause. Cycle broken by truth. She closed the book, placed it on the shelf beside her Christie novels, and reached for the rose-pink shawl. One sleeve remained. She would finish it tonight. Outside, the church clock struck 6. Somewhere in Oxford, Eleanor Everett learned she would live. Somewhere in the manor, Colonel Bantry sat alone in the gun-room, the purday untouched, and in the village, gossip began anew, not of murder, but of redemption. Miss Marple's needles clicked, steady as a heartbeat. The pattern was complete. Chapter 11. The Colonel's Confession. The news of Colonel Bantry's confession reached Rose Hill by tea-time, travelling faster than the milk float and with twice the cream. Mrs. Hargreaves at the post office telephoned Mrs. Price Ridley, who rang the vicarage, who informed the butcher, who told his boy, who shouted it across the green to Tommy Pike. By 5 o'clock the village was a single held breath, waiting for the colonel to be taken away in handcuffs. He was not. Sergeant Polk, promoted beyond his depth, had listened to the colonel's story in the police cottage, accepted the pouch of sovereigns and the spade as evidence, and then, after a long awkward silence, suggested the colonel return home until Scotland Yard arrived in the morning. "No need for dramatics," Polk muttered, wiping his brow. "We're civilized folk." Miss Marple, who had walked the colonel to the station herself, left him on his own doorstep with a quiet word. "Courage, Colonel. Truth is lighter than secrets." Then she returned to Laburnum Cottage, where the kettle was singing, and the rose-pink shawl waited for its final rouse. She had just poured her tea when the knocker sounded. 3 firm raps, military in their precision. Dr. Haydock stood on the step, hat in hand, his face grave. "Miss M., I've just come from the manor. Mrs. Bantry's taken to her bed with hartshorn and hysterics. Lydia's locked herself in the conservatory with the hyacinths. And the colonel, he asked me to fetch you, says he won't speak to the yard without you there. Feels you're the only one who understands." Miss Marple set down her cup. "He understands himself better than he thinks. But I will come." They drove to the manor in the doctor's Austin, the headlights cutting through the dusk. The house loomed dark, only the morning room was lit. Inside, Colonel Bantry sat at the desk, a half-empty decanter of whiskey before him. His tunic was unbuttoned, his medals askew. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. "Sit down, Miss Marple. Haydock, pour the lady a small one. She's earned it." Miss Marple took the chair opposite. "I prefer tea, Colonel, but thank you." He pushed the decanter aside. "I've written it all out. Signed and witnessed by the butler. 1923. Ralph Everett, fresh from Burma, spinning tales of rubies and temples. My sister, Mrs. B's cousin, had just died. Left me guardian to Lydia, age 6. Everett charmed the child, charmed us all. Then Eleanor arrived, his sister, fierce as a tigress, demanding the ruby he'd promised her. They quarrelled in this very room. I lent him the sovereigns to buy her silence, took the ruby as collateral. Thought it best even then. Never dreamed it real. He tapped the confession. When he returned this summer, flush with Bombay money, I asked for repayment. He laughed, said the ruby was long gone, the debt forgotten. At the garden party he mocked me before the guests, hinted at the old scandal. After the last car left, I followed him to the arbor. He was drunk, abusive. I had the spade in my hand, new supports for the roses. One blow. He fell. I carried him inside, staged the scene, buried the coins. Cowardice, as you said. Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And Eleanor?" She arrived the next day, saw the body, assumed I'd killed him for the ruby. She finished what I began, forged the letters, attacked Lydia to silence her. I let her. God help me, I let her. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "The yard will be here at dawn. Manslaughter likely. Provocation, clean record. You'll lose the estate perhaps, but not your life." The colonel nodded. "Lydia will have the house, entailed to her. I've seen the solicitor. She'll marry that gardener boy, grow roses, forget this nightmare." Miss Marple rose. "She will remember, Colonel. But memory can be pruned, like a rose bush. New growth comes from old wood." She placed a small parcel on the desk, the paste ruby, wrapped in tissue. "For Lydia. Let her wear it as a reminder that some treasures are false, but love can be true." The colonel took it, his hand trembling. "You're a saint, Miss Marple." "No," she said, "merely an observer of human folly." Outside, the night was cold and clear. Dr. Haydock drove her home in silence. At Laburnum Cottage she lit the lamp, wound the clock, and finished the shawl. Sleeve, border, all complete. She folded it neatly, tied it with blue ribbon, and set it aside for the vicar's wife. Before bed she opened her notebook one last time. 10. Colonel B struck the blow. Eleanor concealed. Motive: honor, not greed. Justice tempered by mercy. She closed the book, placed it on the shelf, and drew the curtains. The village slept, unaware that its oldest family had been pruned to the quick. In the morning, Scotland Yard arrived. The colonel went quietly, head high. Eleanor Everett's sentence was commuted to 7 years. Lydia Bantry kept the manor, married Tommy Pike in the spring, and planted clematis in the rebuilt arbour. And Miss Marple, knitting a new square in primrose yellow, waited for the next small irregularity in the pattern of village life. For in Rose Hill, as in all villages, the teacups would break again. Chapter 12. The Aftermath. The spring assizes came and went with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled clock. Colonel Bantry, pleading guilty to manslaughter, was sentenced to 5 years, reduced for his war record and the provocation of Everett's taunts. He was sent to an open prison in Devon, where the governor allowed him to tend the vegetable garden and correspond with Lydia about rose pruning. Eleanor Everett, her capital charge dropped to accessory after the fact, received 7 years. She was assigned to the prison library, cataloguing books with the same precision she had once applied to forgery. Rose Hill absorbed the news like rain into parched soil. The manor passed to Lydia, now Mrs. Thomas Pike, who painted the morning room a cheerful primrose and turned the gun room into a nursery. The safe behind the Reynolds miniature was removed. Mrs. Bantry declared combination locks too tempting to fate, and replaced with a simple hook for the colonel's medals, polished weekly by the housemaid. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had become something of a village institution. The Women's Institute voted her honorary president for life. The vicar consulted her on parish disputes, and Sergeant Polk, still adjusting to his stripes, dropped by Laburnum Cottage every Friday for tea and unsolicited advice on crime prevention. Fingerprints, Sergeant, are less reliable than motives. On a golden afternoon in May, Miss Marple walked to the manor to deliver the finished primrose shawl. The garden was a riot of colour. Clematis climbing the rebuilt arbour, hyacinths giving way to tulips, and in the rose bed a new hybrid, deep crimson, named Rose Hill Remembrance, bred by Tommy Pike from the colonel's prize stock. Lydia met her at the door, a toddler on her hip and another clutching her skirt. "Miss Marple, the baby's early, born yesterday, a boy. We've named him Arthur, after the colonel." Miss Marple admired the child, pink, indignant, already waving a fist. "A sturdy name. He'll need it with Pike stubbornness and Bantry pride." Tommy appeared, earth on his boots, a grin splitting his face. "Colonel sent a letter. Says the prison peas are prize winners and he's teaching the lads to graft roses. Reckons he'll be head gardener when he comes home." Mrs. Bantry, now Great-Aunt Dorothy, fluttered in with a tray of lemonade. "And Evelyn's engaged, to the dowager's nephew, a barrister. Writes that the parrots taught her patience, and Shakespeare taught her forgiveness." Miss Marple accepted a glass. "Patience and forgiveness, excellent dowry." They sat in the conservatory, sunlight slanting through the vines. Lydia unwrapped the shawl, exclaimed over the lace border, and draped it over the cradle. "You've given us more than wool, Miss Marple. You gave us truth." "Truth," Miss Marple said, "is like sunlight. It burns at first, then helps things grow." She took her leave as the church clock struck 4. Tea time in Rose Hill, eternal and unhurried. At the gate she paused to admire the remembrance roses. Their scent was rich, forgiving. Back home, she opened her post, a thick envelope from Devon, the colonel's spidery hand. "Dear Miss Marple, the governor says I may apply for parole next year. Lydia writes the baby has my chin. Tell her to plant the new roses deep. Roots need darkness to grow strong. Your debtor always, Arthur Bantry." A second letter, thinner, from Oxford Prison. "Miss Marple, the library here is adequate. I have catalogued the complete works of Jane Austen. Irony is not lost. On me. Thank you for the truth. It is a harsher sentence than hanging, but cleaner. E. Everett." Miss Marple placed both letters in the drawer with Major Blaine's photograph. The brass paperweight had been returned to the shed. The paste ruby was funding a school in Burma. All debts, it seemed, were settled. That evening she began a new piece. Something small in soft green wool. A christening bonnet, perhaps, for young Arthur's sibling. The pattern was simple, but she added a peacoat edge for interest. Outside, the village settled into dusk. The manor windows glowed, the church bell rang for evensong, and in Laburnum Cottage Miss Marple knitted on, her needles clicking like the quiet heartbeat of Rose Hill. The teacup was mended. Mrs. Bantry had it repaired with gold lacquer, in the Japanese style, and displayed it on the mantel as a reminder that broken things could be beautiful. The ruby was gone, the murderer redeemed, the innocent married, and somewhere, in the turning of seasons and the slow growth of roses, the village found its peace. Miss Marple finished the row, turned the work, and began again. Chapter 13. The Lingering Shadow. Summer ripened into a languid haze over Rose Hill. The remembrance roses bloomed twice, their crimson petals carpeting the arbor path like drops of dried blood. Young Arthur Pike took his first steps in the conservatory, tottering between hyacinth pots while his mother clapped and his father watched with the proud bewilderment of a man who had once been suspected of murder. Colonel Bantry's parole was granted in July. He returned to the manor not as master but as guest, given the east wing and a small allowance to tend the gardens he had nearly lost. Eleanor Everett remained in Oxford, her 7 years ticking down with the patience of a woman who had learned to live within walls. She wrote occasionally, brief notes on prison notepaper, always about books. Persuasion was her favorite now. She found Anne Elliot's quiet endurance instructive. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken up watercolors. The vicar's wife insisted it was therapeutic after all that unpleasantness. And so every Tuesday afternoon Miss Marple sat by the duck pond, with a folding stool and a box of paints, attempting to capture the willows in their various greens. The results were modest, but the occupation soothed her. She had closed the notebook on the Everett case, yet a faint shadow lingered. Not doubt, but the knowledge that some truths, once unearthed, cast long echoes. It was on one such Tuesday, the light golden and the air heavy with the scent of meadowsweet, that the shadow took form. She was packing away her paints when a motor car, an unfamiliar Daimler, black and gleaming, drew up beside the green. A woman alighted, tall, fair, dressed in dove-grey silk that spoke of London couture. Her face was Eleanor Everett's, but softened by time and something harder to name. She carried a small portmanteau and a bunch of white lilies. "Miss Marple?" Her voice was low, cultivated with the faintest trace of an accent acquired in hotter climes. "I am Helena Blaine, Major Blaine's daughter. My father wrote of you." Miss Marple closed the paint-box. "Major Blaine's letter was most illuminating. You have come far." "From Mandalay." Helena Blaine's eyes, blue like her aunt's, scanned the green, the cottages, the church spire. "I wished to see the village that broke the curse." "There was no curse," Miss Marple said gently. "Only human frailty." They walked together to the churchyard, where Helena laid the lilies on an unmarked stone, the plot reserved for paupers, where Captain Everett's ashes had been interred after the inquest. No one in Rose Hill had claimed them. "My father sent the paste ruby to the Schwezigon priests," Helena said. "They melted it into a bell. It rings at dawn now, calling the monks to prayer. They say the sound is pure." Miss Marple nodded. "Redemption in small things." Helena turned to her. "Aunt Eleanor writes that you saved her life. She asks if you will visit." "Prisons are not my natural habitat," Miss Marple said, "but I shall write. Letters travel where bodies cannot." They parted at the lich gate. The Daimler carried Helena Blaine away toward the manor. Lydia had invited her to tea, a gesture of reconciliation that would have appalled Mrs. Bantry in her youth, but now seemed fitting. That evening Miss Marple dined with the Pikes. The nursery smelled of talc and warm milk. Arthur, Colonel Bantry, sat in the corner mending a toy train, his hands steadier than they had been in years. Lydia served roast chicken and new potatoes from the garden Tommy had coaxed to abundance. After pudding, gooseberry fool, Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. Miss Marple, I've a confession. Not another murder, dash it, but I kept one sovereign. From the pouch. Thought it might bring luck. Buried it under the remembrance rose the day I came home. Miss Marple smiled. A talisman, Colonel. Let it stay. Roses thrive on buried secrets. Tommy laughed. Reckon that's why they smell so sweet. Later, walking home under a sky pricked with stars, Miss Marple reflected on the summer's small miracles. A child's first steps, a prisoner's library, a rose that bloomed from blood-soaked soil. The teacup on the manor mantel, mended with gold, caught the light differently now, its crack a vein of brightness. At Laburnum Cottage she lit the lamp, wound the clock, and opened her drawer. The notebook was closed, but beside it lay a new sheet. Blank, waiting. She took up her pen. Case closed. Yet every ending is a seed. She set the pen down, satisfied. The green bonnet was finished. Tomorrow she would begin something in lavender, perhaps a scarf for Eleanor Everett, to warm her in the prison winters. Outside the church clock struck 10. The village slept, its scars healed in two. Stories, and Miss Marple, needles poised, began to cast on. The pattern continued. Chapter 14. The Teacup's gold autumn returned to Rose Hill with a rustle of copper leaves and the scent of wood smoke curling from cottage chimneys. The remembrance roses gave one final defiant flush before the frost, and Tommy Pike gathered the hips for jelly, sharp, bright, a taste of winter sweetness. Young Arthur Pike, now toddling with purpose, helped his grandfather, Colonel Bantry, paroled and quietly reinstated as head gardener, sweep the arbour path. Lydia, heavy with her second child, watched from the conservatory window, the gold-mended teacup on the sill beside her, catching the low sun like a small, cracked lantern. Miss Marple, having posted the lavender scarf to Oxford Prison with a note, for the colder evenings, knit your own freedom, stitch by stitch, found herself at loose ends. The village had settled into a rhythm as comforting as afternoon tea. Sergeant Polk's bicycle patrols, Mrs. Price Ridley's new hat feathers, the vicar's wife's expanding nursery. Even Evelyn Pritchard, now Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove of Tunbridge Wells, sent Christmas cards featuring parrots and mortarboards. Yet on the 1st of November, All Saints' Day, a letter arrived that stirred the embers of the old case. It was from Helena Blaine, postmarked Mandalay, written on rice paper thin as a moth's wing. Dear Miss Marple, the bell forged from the false ruby rings clearer each dawn. The priests say the curse is lifted, but a new gift has come. A small boy, orphaned by fever, left at the monastery gate with a note pinned to his blanket. The note reads, in English, His blood is clean. Let the ruby's debt end with him. No signature, but the hand is my aunt's. I have adopted the child. We name him Ralph, after the uncle he will never know. He laughs at the bell. Thank you for teaching us that even broken things can ring true. Helen and Miss Marple read it twice, then carried it to the mantel where the repaired teacup would have stood, had it not been returned to the manor. She placed the letter beside the empty space, a silent benediction. That afternoon she walked to the manor, her marketing basket lined with the last of the Michaelmas daisies. Lydia met her at the door, cheeks round with late pregnancy, eyes bright. Miss Marple, the colonel's in the arbour. He's built a seat under the clematis. Says it's for storytelling when the children are older. They found Colonel Bantry polishing a brass plaque on the new bench, in memory of mistakes forgiven. He looked up, sheepish. Thought it fitting. The sovereign's still under the rose. Let the roots keep it. Luck's been good to us. Miss Marple nodded. Luck, Colonel. Is truth allowed to grow? Tommy appeared, wheeling a barrow of compost. Post came, miss. From Oxford. He handed her a small parcel wrapped in prison brown paper. Inside was a bookmark, hand-embroidered silk, the initial J in delicate script, and a note in Eleanor Everett's precise hand. Miss Marple, the scarf warms more than my neck. I finish my sentence next spring. The library here has taught me that stories end where we choose. I choose here. Thank you for the pattern. Miss Marple slipped the bookmark into her prayer book between the Psalms and the marriage service. Patterns, she reflected, were everywhere, if one knew where to look. Tea was served in the morning room, scones, blackberry jam, the gold-mended teacup proudly in use. Mrs. Bantry, Great-Aunt Dorothy, poured with trembling ceremony. "To new beginnings," she declared, raising her cup. The teacup's crack caught the light, a thin vein of gold running through the roses. Miss Marple sipped, tasted bergamot and forgiveness, and set the cup down, gently. Outside, the church bell rang for evensong. The village gathered. Sergeant Polk in his best tunic, Mrs. Price Ridley with a new feather, the vicar's wife with her brood. They sang, "The Day Thou Gavest," voices rising through the rafters like incense. Miss Marple walked home in the dusk, the Michaelmas daisies wilting gracefully in her basket. At Laburnum Cottage she lit the lamp, wound the clock, and opened her drawer. The notebook was full. She began a new one, its first page blank and expectant. She wrote, "Case closed." The teacup mended, the ruby redeemed, the curse transformed into a bell, human nature, broken, gilded, ringing true. She closed the book, set it beside the old, and took up her needles. Something small, in white wool, another christening bonnet, for the child due in Tunbridge Wells. Outside, the first star pricked the sky. Rose Hill slept, its scars turned to gold, and Miss Marple knitted on, the pattern of village life unfolding stitch by quiet stitch. The teacup's gold held. The bell in Mandalay rang, and in the gentle rhythm of needles and wool the world turned toward morning.